The wind was a physical blow, tearing at her thin cloak, stealing the last vestiges of warmth from her bones. Each step was a struggle, a desperate battle against the snow that swirled in blinding eddies, against the biting cold that promised oblivion. Her lungs ached, raw and burning with the frigid air. Behind her, somewhere in the swirling white void, were the things she ran from, not just men, but cruelty, a life extinguished, and the crushing weight of a future stolen. Fear was a cold knot in her belly, sharper than the wind. She stumbled, falling to her knees in a drift, the snow like icy claws tearing at her exposed skin. Pain shot up her ankle, a fresh torment atop the dull throb that permeated her entire body. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't. She pushed herself up, ignoring the scream of her muscles, the rasp of her breath. Days blurred into a nightmare sequence of frozen landscapes, meager shelter beneath rock overhangs, and the gnawing ache of hunger. She had nothing, had fled with only the clothes on her back and the terror in her soul. She had no name she dared use, no past she could acknowledge. Just the desperate need to put distance between herself and them. She was a ghost in the white wilderness, a whisper against the roar of the storm. Then, through the swirling snow, a light, not a star, too steady, too low. A window, a dwelling. The hope that surged through her was quickly tempered by caution. A dwelling meant people. People could be saviors, or they could be worse than the cold. But the alternative was certain death here, in the heart of the storm. She aimed herself towards the faint glow, her pace picking up with a last, desperate surge of adrenaline. The building emerged from the white haze, a low, sturdy structure of logs and stone, huddled against the wind. It was isolated, miles from anywhere she could discern. A ranch, judging by the corrals swallowed by snowdrifts. Smoke plumed steadily from a stone chimney, a beacon of warmth in this hostile world. She reached the porch, her legs giving out entirely. She crawled the last few feet, collapsing against the door, her gloved fist weakly pounding. A sound pitiful and weak. Tears froze on her cheeks. She had nothing left to give, save this one, fragile plea. The pounding stopped. Silence stretched, broken only by the shriek of the wind. Had they not heard? Or worse, had they heard and chosen to ignore? Despair, cold and absolute, threatened to engulf her. Just as the darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision, the door creaked open. A man stood silhouetted against the dim light of the interior. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadow and the wide brim of a hat. He didn't speak, just stood there, a silent, imposing figure, the living embodiment of this harsh, unforgiving land. She could feel his gaze, assessing, wary. She pushed herself up onto her knees, her voice a broken whisper, barely audible above the storm. "Please, I need help. I'm running," she couldn't say from what. The words caught in her throat. She just stared up at him, a fragile offering of desperate need. He remained motionless for a long moment, the silence amplifying the sound of her ragged breathing and the howl of the wind. The air crackled with his unspoken decision. His presence was immense, rooted to the spot like an ancient tree. She saw his eyes then, glinting in the dim light, sharp, assessing, revealing nothing and everything all at once. He was a man used to solitude, to making hard choices in a hard world. The air outside felt colder now, the storm more menacing, highlighting the fragile barrier between her and the elements, between life and death. Her fate rested on this man's silent judgment. The plea hung in the air, a fragile thread against the storm's fury. She waited, shivering, hoping against hope that the man would see past the tattered clothes and the fear, to the desperate human need beneath. He stepped back, opening the door wider, though his posture remained rigid, unwelcoming. He didn't offer a hand, didn't speak a word of greeting or question. It was an invitation born of necessity, perhaps, or a grim duty, rather than welcome. She scrambled inside, half crawling, half stumbling, collapsing just beyond the threshold. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, leather, and something wild, untamed, the smell of the man, perhaps, or the life he lived. It was blessedly warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The door closed with a solid thud, sealing her in with him, cutting off the howl of the wind but not the silence that stretched between them. She lay on the rough-hewn floorboards, gasping for breath, her body trembling uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. She dared not move, acutely aware of his presence. He stood a few feet away, watching her. She could feel his gaze, heavy and assessing, taking in her state, the tattered clothes, the snow-matted hair, the raw hands, the limp in her ankle. She finally managed to push herself into a sitting position, leaning against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. She kept her head down, avoiding his eyes, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The room was simple, spare. A fireplace crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows. A table, a couple of chairs, shelves lined with practical items, tins, bags of flour, tools. Nothing decorative, nothing soft. Everything spoke of utility and self-reliance. He finally moved, walking to the fireplace. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask why she was running. He simply stoked the fire, added another log. The silence was unnerving. It wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken questions, with his palpable caution. She risked a glance at him. He was removing his hat, revealing a face etched with lines, weathered and stern. Dark eyes, like the storm clouds outside, held no easy answers. He was rugged, self-contained, a man who belonged to the land, not society. He looked like he could face down a blizzard or a bear with equal, quiet determination. He moved with an economy of motion, every action purposeful. He went to a corner, returning with a thick wool blanket. He dropped it near her, not handing it to her, just placing it within reach. He then poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and set it beside the blanket. Again, no words. Simple actions, stark necessities. She reached for the blanket, pulling it around her shoulders, the rough wool a blessing against her frozen skin. She picked up the cup, her hand shaking, and drank. The water was cool and pure, the first she'd had in days that wasn't melted snow. It was a small comfort, a tangible act of what? Charity? Prudence? She couldn't tell. "You're hurt," he said finally, his voice low, gravelly and used. He wasn't asking, he was stating a fact. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She gestured vaguely towards her ankle. He knelt down, his movement surprisingly gentle despite his size. He carefully pushed back the edge of her cloak, examining her foot and ankle. His fingers were rough but steady. She flinched slightly at the pain as he probed, but she didn't pull away. She needed help, more than she needed to hide the pain. "Twisted," he pronounced. "Maybe worse." He stood up. "Can't do much for it now. Keep it wrapped." He gestured to the blanket. He then turned and walked towards the back of the cabin, disappearing into the shadows. He didn't tell her where to go, where to sit, or what to do. She was simply there. A problem that had presented itself on his doorstep. Fear still lingered, a cold residue, but it was tempered by the basic fact of being inside, being warm, being safe from the immediate threat of the storm. Safe from him? She didn't know. He was an unknown quantity, solitary and silent. Her mind, though weary, began to turn over the possibilities. What if he asked questions she couldn't answer? What if he decided she was trouble and turned her out? The world outside was a white hell, but the world inside, within the walls of this man's home, felt equally precarious. She watched the shadows near the back of the cabin, listening intently to the sounds, the creak of floorboards, the clinking of something metal. He was there, a silent sentinel, her reluctant protector, or perhaps her captor. The air remained thick with tension, with unspoken histories and uncertain futures. She spent the rest of the day huddled by the fire, wrapped in the blanket, the man occasionally moving about the cabin with quiet efficiency. He prepared a simple meal stew from a pot on the hearth. He set a bowl of it on the table, gesturing with his head towards it. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, not because it was fine fare, but because it was sustenance, warmth, life itself. He ate his own meal silently, watching her from across the room. His gaze wasn't intrusive, merely observant, like a rancher watching a new, skittish animal in the corral. He still hadn't asked her name or why she was running, and she hadn't offered the information. A silent accord had been reached, born of mutual caution. He didn't pry and she didn't volunteer. The silence wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of two strangers thrust together by circumstance, assessing each other, measuring the risks. As dusk settled, he indicated a spot on the floor near the fire with a curt nod. "Sleep there," he said, his voice still rough and minimal. It wasn't an offer of comfort, just a designation of space. She nodded her understanding, too weary to speak. She lay down on the floor, the blanket pulled tight, using her arm as a pillow. The floor was hard, but it was infinitely preferable to the frozen ground outside. She watched him for a while as he went about his evening routine, banking the fire, checking the door locks. He didn't appear to carry a weapon openly, but she sensed he was capable, dangerous in a quiet, contained way. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into near darkness, save for the glow of the embers. He then retreated to a bed in the back of the cabin. She heard the rustle of blankets, his breathing, steady and deep. Sleep did not come easily. Her ankle throbbed, and her mind replayed the events that had led her here, the faces of the men she fled, the scene of the fire. Each memory was a shard of ice in her heart. But beneath the fear and the pain, a fragile seed of resilience began to stir. She had survived. Against all odds, she had reached shelter. This man, this silent, stoic stranger, had not turned her away. It wasn't much, not yet trust, not yet safety, but it was a start. She listened to the storm outside, its fury undiminished, and to the quiet sounds of the man sleeping nearby. Two solitary souls, bound together by the storm and her desperate flight. The air remained heavy with unspoken questions, with the unknown dangers that still lay outside these walls. But for this one night she was warm, she was sheltered. And that, in this harsh world, was a victory. The next morning, the storm had lessened, but the world outside was a landscape of deep drifts and muffled silence. The man was already up when she awoke, stoking the fire. He still hadn't pressed her for information. He simply moved about his routine, acknowledging her presence with brief glances, but no conversation. Her ankle was swollen and painful, making movement difficult. She tried to help, offering to wash the few dishes, but he waved her away with a curt motion. "Sit," he grunted. He seemed uncomfortable with her attempts at contribution, preferring the established order of his solitary existence. He spent the day working outside, clearing snow from the immediate area around the cabin, tending to the needs of his unseen animals. She watched him through the window, a figure of quiet strength against the vast, white backdrop. He was a man of the land, accustomed to battling the elements alone. He didn't seem to need or want company. Yet, he hadn't sent her away, even after the worst of the storm had passed. That single act, his reluctant shelter, weighed heavily in her assessment of him. As the days passed, a routine of sorts developed, built on silence and observation. Her ankle slowly began to heal, though still weak. She found small ways to be useful, tasks he didn't prevent her from doing. Sweeping the floor, folding blankets, preparing simple food from the stores. She learned his habits. He rose before dawn, worked until dusk, ate his meals in silence, read by the fire for a short time before sleeping. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in short, practical sentences. She learned his name, eventually not from him but from markings on some tools, Silas. She still hadn't told him anything about herself, about why she was running. The fear remained, a constant companion, but the silence around the subject was becoming its own form of communication. He knew she was hiding something significant, dangerous even, yet he hadn't demanded answers. His patience, or perhaps his indifference, was a strange form of protection. She began to feel less like a trespasser and more like a fixture, albeit a temporary one. One evening, the wind picked up again, rattling the window panes. She tensed instinctively, her body remembering the terror of her flight. Silas looked up from his reading, his eyes meeting hers across the room. It was the first time he had truly seemed to see her, not just as a problem or a guest, but as someone with a history etched in fear. He didn't speak, but his gaze was steady, acknowledging the unseen threat that still shadowed her. In that moment of shared understanding, a fragile thread of connection formed between them, stronger than any words they might have spoken. He rose and went to the door, checking the simple bolt, then stood by the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. His posture was alert, watchful. It wasn't just the weather he was concerned about. He knew, or he suspected. The silence had given way to a quiet tension, filled with the unspoken possibility that what she was running from might follow. The next morning there were riders, not near the house, not yet, but visible from a distance, moving cautiously through the still deep snow of the valley below. 3 of them. Her blood ran cold. They had found her or were close to it. Her breath hitched in her throat. Silas was standing beside her at the window. He didn't say, "Who are they?" or "Are they looking for you?" He simply said, his voice low and color sharp, "Get down." He moved quickly, but without panic, securing the cabin further, checking his rifle. He was preparing for a siege, not just for himself but for her. In that moment, the last vestiges of her fear of him evaporated, replaced by a surge of gratitude and a fierce, protective instinct for the fragile sanctuary he had provided. She looked at him, this quiet, solitary man, ready to face danger for a stranger on his doorstep. His stoicism wasn't indifference. It was strength, deeply held and now, unexpectedly, shared. They waited. The riders moved slowly, systematically searching the valley. Every nerve ending screamed at her to flee, to draw the danger away from Silas and his home. But she couldn't. Her ankle still wasn't strong enough, and the thought of facing the wilderness again, knowing they were out there, was paralyzing. More importantly, she felt a fierce loyalty to this man who had given her refuge. Silas didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He simply prepared to defend his home and the person in it. He handed her a rifle, his eyes meeting hers. "You know how to use this?" His voice was gruff, practical. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she took the weapon. Her father had taught her. It seemed a lifetime ago. "Good," he said. "Stay low. Don't make noise." The riders were closer now, their figures clearer against the snow. She recognized one of them, the cruelest of the 3. Her gut twisted with fear and loathing. They were heading towards the ranch. There was no more waiting, only facing. Silas moved to the front window, positioning himself carefully. She knelt by the side window, rifle ready. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant crunch of snow under horses' hooves. The riders reached the edge of the clearing. They stopped, scanning the cabin, the corrals, the outbuildings. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The confrontation. She had run, she had hidden, but ultimately, there was no escaping the past. It had found her here, on this remote ranch, in this man's quiet world. Silas raised his rifle, resting it on the windowsill. It was a clear warning. They saw the movement. They hesitated. One of them, the one she recognized, spurred his horse forward, calling out, his voice rough and demanding. "Hello, the house. We're looking for someone." Silas didn't reply. He simply held his position, rifle steady. The rider yelled again, adding a veiled threat. Silas fired, not at the rider, but into the snow a few feet in front of his horse. The shot echoed through the valley, a deafening roar that shattered the silence. The horse reared, startled. The rider cursed, pulling back. They huddled together, conferring. The air outside crackled with tension. Silas remained silent, his gaze fixed on them. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't backing down. He was defending his boundary, his peace, his reluctant sanctuary. After a long, tense moment, the three riders turned their horses. They weren't going to risk an open confrontation, not with an armed man in a defensible position. Not yet. They rode away, back the way they came, disappearing into the vastness of the valley. She let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands still trembled, but it wasn't just fear now. It was adrenaline, relief. Silas lowered his rifle. He didn't say anything about the riders, didn't ask if they were the ones she fled. He didn't need to. The air was thick with what had passed between them, the silent acknowledgement of shared danger and shared defense. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. There was no softening in his gaze, but the wariness was gone, replaced by something akin to recognition. She was no longer just a stranger on his doorstep. She was someone he had defended. The threat had receded, but it hadn't vanished. They both knew that. They might be back, or others might come, but something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't just running anymore. She had stopped, she had been given refuge, and now she had helped defend that refuge. She stood taller, the rifle feeling solid and capable in her hands. The fear hadn't completely left her, but it was no longer a paralyzing force. It was a spur, a reminder of what she had to protect. Herself, yes, but also this quiet, unexpected haven, and the man who had provided it. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the quiet understanding of allies. She looked at Silas, this man of few words and immense strength. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and had, in his own way, given her strength. She had fled danger and found herself not just surviving, but beginning to stand. The harsh landscape outside remained, a constant reminder of the world's cruelty, but inside, within these simple walls, a fragile resilience had taken root, nurtured by quiet acts of refuge and the unexpected solidarity forged in the face of threat. She was no longer alone in her fight, and somehow, the future, though uncertain, felt less terrifying, more like a path to be walked, step by careful step, rather than an abyss to be fled. Her transformation wasn't complete, but the journey from fearful vulnerability to quiet strength had begun, here on the doorstep of a stubborn rancher, who had, in his silent way, opened the door not just to his home, but to a possibility of hope.